Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Lunch and Learn Program. I'm Penny Cleff, Education Specialist here at the Archives. We are so glad that you've joined us for our November presentation. Our Lunch and Learn programs are held on the second Friday of the month and are sponsored by Friends of Georgia Archives and History. Thank you, FOGA. If you want to learn more about FOGA or purchase this year's Christmas ornament, go to www.fogah.org. During this pandemic, we want to offer you lunch and learn programs safely in a virtual format. As always, I'm thankful that my colleague, Alec Hawthorne, is taking care of the technical side of these virtual presentations. Alec will upload the video of this lunch and learn to our YouTube channel, Georgia Archives. So if you have friends who are unable to watch the presentation live, they don't have to miss out and can always see them later on YouTube. We are pleased to have as our November speaker, Georgia Archives Conservator Sigourney Smuts, whose presentation today is Taming the Monster, Conserving a Forgotten Map. Please ask your questions at the end of the presentations. You'll see a small Q&A button where you can post them. Before we begin, let me share a little bit about our speaker. Sigourney joined the Georgia Archives as conservator in 2019. She holds a master's degree in conservation art from Northumbria University in the United Kingdom and has 10 years of experience in the conservation field, working both in the US and abroad. As well as being an active educator and advocate for conservation in Georgia, she is a member of the Southeast Regional Conservation Association and is the co-chair of education for the Heritage Emergency Response Alliance. Welcome, Sigourney.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. To support the Georgia Archives mission of preserving the state's historical records, it is the responsibility of the Conservation Department to aid in preventing the collection items from being damaged, as well as caring for the items that have been damaged to repair and stabilize them. For this presentation, I'll be discussing a project we had here in the Georgia Archives Conservation Lab and the treatment processes that were performed by the conservation staff and interns in conserving a very large, very damaged map. In August of 2019, the collections manager, Henry Miller, brought up to the conservation lab what he termed the Franken-box. It was a box that was comprised of 3 archival boxes stapled together to make one much bigger box. The Franken-box was still wrapped in the shrink wrap plastic from the move from our old building in the early 2000s to our current building. It didn't have any identifying labels, and Henry had no idea what was inside it. This one little piece of paper you see here is all the documentation we had, and that was little to nothing. So he brought it to the lab so that we could open it and assess what was inside and then determine what to do with it. We opened the box to find one very large rolled map. When we unrolled the map, we discovered that was much larger than we expected and in terrible condition. It was so brittle and damaged that we couldn't re-roll it without causing further damage, but we also couldn't store it flat because of its size. So we're stuck in a position where we just had to treat it. The first step in treating any object is to understand what you're working on. When deciding what is ethically appropriate and how you're going to treat an object, it is important to understand the object's history and how it will be used. The map is of Fulton County from 1893. It shows the plats and names of the then current owners and businesses. As a point of interest, Fulton County is much smaller on the map presented than it is today. This is because it's a map before Fulton absorbed Milton and Campbell counties in 1931 after they went bankrupt during the Great Depression. The map is a valuable asset to the archives collection, as there are very few maps that shows the land lottery lots as well as the land owners. This gives a good snapshot of the time of the county. It is valuable for researchers who are looking for the names and locations of businesses. The map also includes later inscriptions and stickers to add new information as the county developed, but we don't know when these were added or by whom. We're also not sure when the map was given to the archives or its life and use before we took possession of it that resulted to the damage that we see here. As a point of interest, you can see these little white dots. Those are the little stickers that were later added. To decide what is practically appropriate when you're treating an object, you need to understand the materials that were used to create it. As described, it was a very large map at 10 feet by 4 feet. In fact, it barely fitted on our tables in the lab. It was originally comprised of 6 separate pieces of paper that were printed before the map was assembled, and they were overlapped where they met. The yellow squares you are seeing here roughly outline where those original pieces of paper were in the map before we started treatment. The sheets of paper that the map was made of is poor quality wove wood fiber paper. This is the same sort of paper that is used to do newspapers, or if you buy an old paperback book, it's that poor quality mass-produced paper. The sheets of the paper were attached to a fabric lining with an animal glue adhesive. Here you can see some of that fabric lining showing through in one of the holes. This was a very common practice for maps to have this fabric lining, as it was a method to strengthen the map, as well as allow for it to be rolled or hung on a wall. But this is actually not a very good method for the long-term stability of an object. The object's media is a chromolithograph. This is a printing process that is done on a flat surface, and there are different printing plates for each color. So the green, the blue, the pink, and even the black media were each individual plates that were then printed separately on top of each other. Here in this bottom image, you can see where the registration was slightly off in the printing process, and a bit of pink bled out on the edge of one of the yellow areas. As I said, the map has additional inscriptions, and these were done in graphite pencil, color pencil, and ink. Here in the green squares, you can see some of those additional graphite pencil inscriptions delineating new road markings in that area of the county. These yellow arrows are pointing to a few of those stickers, and these have ink inscriptions on them. You also need to understand the condition of the object when you're devising a treatment plan so you can figure out what your end goal is. The wood pulp paper is very brittle, and because of the poor quality paper and all its rolling and poor handling, the map has lots of tears and fractures. These were mostly around the edges of the map as well as along the top third. Because the map was so brittle and torn, there were areas where the paper had been lost and simply just fallen off, detached from the fabric lining. There were also a few small burn holes, which have that characteristic dark brown burnt edge, as well as areas of the paper which had the surface abraded, either due to poor handling or insect grazing across the surface of the map, and this would remove that very top surface of the paper and taking the media off as well. As I said, the fabric lining was not a very good idea for the stability of the object, and this is because fabric and paper are not compatible materials. When paper gets wet, it expands. However, when fabric gets wet, it contracts, and vice versa as objects dry out. Because the fabric is stronger than the paper, the fabric tends to just win this battle and tear the paper apart. So here you can see examples of where the paper has fractures and tears because the fabric is just pulling on it. Because of how brittle the paper was, rolling it to fit into that storage box then caused additional damage. Here in the yellow circles, you can see some losses and tears around the edges due to some of that rolling and handling. The rolling also caused distortions to the map. So here you can see where there's a crease in the map due to the rolling, as well as some undulation along the top, where the map is no longer lying flat. That poor quality wood pulp paper is also inherently acidic, and as it degrades, the paper becomes more and more brown, and that acidity increases. So if you think about leaving a piece of newspaper out in the sun, how it discolors and becomes very brittle and old, those same processes are happening here in this map. The acidity will break down the paper fibers and then make it even more brittle, and it will have this vicious cycle of the acidity increasing the degradation and then increasing the acidity with it. The map also has this characteristic musty smell that develops with acidic paper. There was some additional localized staining and liquid splatters, which you can see here in the yellow circles. And finally, the map was very, very dirty. The whole map was covered in surface dirt and dust. This was predominantly along the top third of the map, and this was because of how the map was rolled. That area of the map was exposed to the elements more, so whatever dust and dirt was drifting down onto it fell in those areas. Here at the bottom image, you can see some of that ingrained dirt and dust in the paper as well as in the fabric backing. When you are treating an object, you follow a progression of processes. The first step is to assess the object and determine its history and use, as well as the materials and the condition, which we have just discussed. Based on this information, you will determine what is practically appropriate for your object to stabilize it. Then you'll determine what is ethically appropriate. In this case, the map is an archival object, so there's a much more strong focus on honoring the history of the object, and this includes any later additions as well as some of the damage. These things can show the history and the use of the object and the life it has had. These assessments will give you a treatment goal, but to see if the treatment is possible, you will need to conduct some preliminary testing to figure out if those treatments are possible, and this testing will be done to both the paper and the media. These assessments and tests will help you develop your treatment plan. And as you follow through your treatment plan to treatment, you'll need to reassess the object as you are treating it to see how it's going. That preliminary testing will only give you an idea of how the object will respond to actual treatment, and this may be different as you are going through your treatments. So you may be forced to adjust your plan if things don't go as you want. With this map, there were two major hurdles that needed to be overcome. Firstly, the map was so large that it's very difficult for us to be able to treat it and manipulate it safely without causing potential further damage. The second problem was how fractured and torn the map was. The only thing stopping this map from turning into a giant jigsaw puzzle was that fabric lining. But as said, that lining was damaging the paper, and to properly treat the map, the lining would need to be removed. The first problem of the size was solved by separating the map into 6 individual sheets of paper. If you remember when I first discussed the makeup of the object, it was one map made up of 6 individual sheets. So it's just a matter of separating 6 sheets out. The preliminary testing with deionized water, this is water that has been filtered to remove any heavy minerals and particulates. This testing showed that the adhesive was water soluble, which is great. However, the printing ink, all those chromolithograph inks, as well as the inscriptions and additional stickers were not water soluble. This means that we could use deionized water to treat this map and to separate them. The sheets were separated by placing strips of a reusable conservation fabric called Everlon, soaked in deionized water, over the overlapped areas, which would then swell and soften that adhesive. We could then slide a spatula between the layers of paper to separate them. The fabric was then cut with scissors. This now resulted in 6 more manageably sized sheets, and these could then be treated individually. The lining was not historically important and had no informational value, so we didn't need to bother about preserving it. One of the side effects of using moisture to separate the sheets is that some of that discoloration in the paper was water soluble. So this meant that the discoloration moved to the wet-dry interface of the paper. You can see here how the map color on this side is a much browner tone compared to this other side, which was kind of washed. These tide lines weren't a problem though, because the plan was to wash the map. So because this discoloration is water soluble, it would be washed out during that process. After the sheets were separated, the sheets needed to be surface cleaned to remove as much as possible of that surface dirt and dust. We decided to use these polyurethane makeup sponges to clean the map, as this is a very gentle and controllable method. You can imagine how brittle and fractured these fragments were, that if we put too much pressure on them, they would just break apart. However, it wasn't very easy or possible to surface clean some areas of the map because it was just too fractured and we would risk damaging them too much. You can see from the after images of these polyurethane sponges just how discolored and dirty the map was. Then there was the second hurdle of how fractured the map was, which would just fall apart without that fabric lining. This problem was overcome by applying temporary Japanese paper facings with wheat starch paste adhesive. These are essentially little tear-repairs that would hold the fragments together during treatment. You can see here those little white rectangles are those little facings that were applied in two different areas of the maps. The wheat starch paste adhesive used is a water-soluble adhesive, so it means that the facings could easily be removed after treatment. After the facings were applied, the fabric lining was gently peeled off the back of each of those 6 sheets. After all this preparation, we're now in a position to begin the actual washing treatments. Before washing, it is important to do additional testing with all the washing solutions and chemicals that may be used. This is to ensure that none of them will negatively affect any of the media and cause damage. Here you can see one of our 2020 conservation interns, Sarah Lanham, applying a small drop of a chemical solvent to that red media of the sticker. She then places a small piece of blotting paper over that little droplet and holds down for a few seconds. When she lifts it off, she'll look at it to see if there is any of the media that has offset onto that blotting paper. And if any of the media has offset, we know that that media is soluble in that solution. This process needs to be done on every different type of media with every different type of solvent or solution that is used. So that includes all the different printing ink colors, as well as all the different inscription media. This process actually ruled out one potential washing aid that we wanted to use, as it did solubilize that red sticker media. The next step was to wash the map, one piece at a time. Washing can be beneficial to paper as it reduces the soluble discoloration and acidity and staining. During the washing process, the hydrogen bonds between the cellulose fibers is suspended, and then upon drying, new bonds are created in more locations. This can be beneficial as it can help reduce some of that embrittlement. Just as a small disclaimer, I am a trained paper conservator who literally has a degree in paper washing. I would not recommend that anyone try to wash any documents at home. There are a number of different washing methods that are available, and for this particular object, we decided to use a blotter washing method. This is because it would allow for the paper fragments to be supported throughout the treatment. For this washing process, we use the conservation fabric Evolon instead of actual blotting paper, even though that's the technique's name. This is because Evolon is a reusable material, so it is better for the environment and less wasteful. Regardless of whether Evolon, Tech Wipe, which is a similar fabric, or blotting paper is used, these all use capillary washing dynamics. Just for ease of reference, I'm going to continue using the term Evolon instead of non-woven microfilament polyester polyamide conservation fabric. The first process in washing is to humidify the item to be washed. This slowly introduces moisture into the paper, allowing it to relax and expand. This will then mean that the paper will have good contact with the washing blotters, as well as not to stress out the fibers too quickly. In the photo here, you can see one of the pieces of the map in a humidity chamber under plastic. While the map was humidifying for a few hours, a pH-adjusted washing solution of deionized water with calcium hydroxide alkali was made up. This was then used to saturate the sheets of Evelyn. In this photo, you can see the two conservation interns, Sarah Lanham again, as well as Jenny Kerchak, wetting up the Evelyn in a sink. Then the humidified map was placed on the wet Evelyn. The map was supported using large sheets of a non-woven polyester. This polyester sheeting means that Sarah and Jenny could safely handle the fragile, damp paper without damaging it or potentially tearing the corner off. The top sheet of the non-woven polyester was removed so that Sarah and Jenny could see how the map was wetting up. The darker areas of the paper you're seeing here are where the paper has wet up, and the lighter areas are the drier areas yet to wet up. The paper would not wet up or wash properly unless it was in full contact with that Evelyn below. So in the bottom image, you can see Sarah and Jenny gently pressing the paper against the Evelyn. Here you got a picture of the interns turning the camera on me. As the map was so creased and damaged, it did not have all the pieces properly aligned. So here I am realigning some of those pieces so that they'll properly lay out on the Evelyn. In some of those cases, those temporary Japanese paper facings needed to be removed to allow for those pieces to be shifted around and realigned. And then it's just a matter of allowing the map to wash. This is done through capillary action where the discoloration and acidity is drawn down into the Evelyn below. The map needs to be monitored throughout this process to ensure that the media is not being negatively affected and the washing is happening as desired. So this can be a couple of hours of essentially babysitting a map. My brother likes to joke that I'm professionally paid to watch paper dry. After time, the Evelyn will need to be replaced with clean new sheets and then wet up with a fresh washing solution as it becomes saturated with discoloration and degradation products. Here in these photos, you can see that brown discoloration moving from the map above to the white Evelyn below. And here, where the map has been removed, you can actually see the outline of the discoloration where the map was. To do this, it's simply a matter of lifting the map out of the bath using those sheets of non-woven polyester as support, having the dirty Evelyn removed, and then repeating steps 2 through 5 of our washing recipe. After the map has been sufficiently washed, it is then time to alkalize it. This is done using an alkali solution following those same washing processes that we've just done. This is used, an alkali called calcium hydroxide was used, and this counteracts those non-soluble acidities. So if you remember, we could wash out the soluble acidity, but some of it isn't soluble. And having the reaction of the alkali with that acid then counteracts that, and we can then remove those acids. This also raises the pH of the paper, as well as imparts an alkali buffer into the paper that will counteract future acidity as the paper ages. So it's kind of paper's own anti-aging treatment. Once all the washing and alkalization processes were completed, the map was removed from the bath. It was turned upside down onto a table. We still had some remaining animal glue adhesive from that fabric lining that was removed early on. This adhesive had swirled with that moisture, so it meant that we could then have the chance to remove it completely. Here you can see the Assistant Conservator, Tracy Johnson, reducing that adhesive with damp cotton swabs. You can see here the darker grayer area is the area which still has the adhesive, and the cleaner areas are where she had already removed that adhesive. That grey color is because of the dirt that was trapped in that adhesive. Once we had completed all the washing processes, which helped reduce the acidity of the map, improve its stability, and reduce some of that discoloration, we now needed to deal with the structural damage. As I said, the map was very fragmented and torn. Because of the extensive damage to it, we decided that the best solution was to line the whole back of each sheet with a piece of Japanese paper attached with wheat starch paste adhesive. Japanese paper is a wonderful material for paper conservation as it is very flexible and strong for its weight, as it has these long fibers. The wheat starch paste is also excellent and does not discolor, as well as it is water soluble if somebody wants to come and remove the lining later in the future. The Japanese paper also doesn't discolor and is naturally alkali and not acidic. The lining process took place immediately after washing the map so as not to allow the paper to dry in between. This was because every time the paper gets wet and dries, it expands and contracts, and this can stress those already very fragile fibers. The first step in the lining process was to cook up the wheat starch paste, which is literally cooked on a stove in a pot. The map at this point was still wet from the washing, so it was fully expanded and relaxed. The same needed to be done with the Japanese paper lining paper. It was important that both the lining paper and the map to be lined were fully expanded and relaxed to ensure that they don't fight against each other as they dry and age in the future. So here you can see in the top image, Sarah spraying deionized water onto the lining paper. That would then increase the moisture content to relax it out. This was then placed between two sheets of polyester film, and that was then smoothed out with a brush to ease out the tensions and reduce any creases that may have formed, which you can see Jenny doing at the bottom. Once the lining paper is fully relaxed and humidified, the next step is to apply the wheat starch paste adhesive to the lining paper. The lining paper was still supported on its polyester film. It is easier and safer to apply the paste to the lining paper and not to the object itself, as the object is damaged and you may cause further damage in that process. You also don't want to oversaturate the object with adhesive. To apply the lining, the map was placed face down on a sheet of polyester film. The lining paper on its polyester film was then flipped face down. Because the map pieces were so big, this was definitely a two-person job in placing the lining paper onto the back of the map. So here you can see Sarah and myself dropping the lining onto the back of the map. We started at one edge of the map here, and then slowly dropped it as I brushed the lining paper against the map to ensure that it had good contact and there were no creases or bubbles. After this was done, the polyester film was rolled off the lining and replaced with that same non-woven polyester sheeting that was used during the washing. This polyester sheeting, the adhesive doesn't like sticking to that polyester sheeting very easily, so it means that it can be removed later easily, as well as stops the map sticking to anything else. The map was then flipped over and the polyester film was removed from the front and replaced with the non-woven polyester, as was done on the back. As previously discussed, the wheat starch paste that was used for the facings is water soluble. So while the map was still wet, but it was safely lined, it was an ideal moment for us to remove these little facings so that we wouldn't have to re-wet the object. So here you can see some of these little darker rectangles are actually those little pieces of facing. And what you're seeing is that even after all the washing and surface cleaning, they had trapped some dirt under them. So we wanted to get those off while it was nicely wet. At the same time, it was ideal for us to conduct a last surface cleaning using damp cotton swabs. You can see how dirty these cotton swabs got and how much dirt was still on this object even after everything had been through. And finally, it became time for us to press the map. This was done between those sheets of non-woven polyester because we don't want it to stick to anything, and then between felts with weights on top. The reason behind this method is that it will control how the paper dries and ensure that it will be flat after drying. If you've ever wet paper and just let it dry, you'll see how it goes all wobbly. We didn't want that to happen, and by having it pressed between these felts, it would then stay flat. The objects were left to press for approximately 2 weeks to ensure that they were fully dry. Occasionally, the felts were removed and replaced with dry felts to ensure that the object was drying thoroughly. And the result was 6 conserved and stabilized pieces of the map. It was decided early on not to reassemble the map back into one large piece, but to leave them as the 6 individual pieces. This was because it would be unsafe for us to re-roll the map. Even after all the treatments that have been done, the paper and the object itself are still very brittle and fragile, and we would potentially cause further damage trying to roll it up again. It would also be more accessible to researchers in individual pieces rather than one very large map. And if we did want to have researchers use it, they would be constantly rolling it and unrolling it, which would not be safe. We also simply didn't have the space to store the map flat, rolled or unrolled at its full size. But should it be necessary in the future, it would be very easy for a later conservator to reassemble the map, either temporarily, whether it's for an exhibit or some other event, or permanently. The full treatment took little over a year. However, we were not able to work on it for most of that time due to COVID-19 and the lockdown. To give you an idea of the before and after of the map, I digitally reconstructed the map into its full size. So this is just an illustrative idea of what the after image would be if we were to reassemble the whole object. As the map is an archival object, we didn't want to replace any of the paper losses, as this would give the wrong impression about the original material and would also be unethical for us to guess what media and materials were missing. So that's why you see here these white areas of loss are remaining. These are far more visible in the after image compared to the before image because the fabric lining, that dirty fabric lining, is disguising those losses. The 6 pieces are now housed at the archives in individual polyester sleeves and then together in an archival folder in our vaults. The images of the conserved map, both the pieces as well as this combined image, have been placed on the archives virtual vault, and this is accessible through the archives website. And you can find, if you use the search terms 1893 Fulton map, it will bring it up and you are more than welcome to have a look at it there. This project was also a wonderful learning opportunity for our 2020 interns, Sarah and Jenny. As there were so many pieces and quite a few treatment processes involved, it gave them a chance to learn several very complex techniques, as well as for each of them to take the lead for a piece of the map. I must commend them on the way they both worked on their pieces and the good job that they did. I would like to thank Sarah, Tracy and Jenny for their assistance with this very labour-intensive and daunting project, and I'm sure that you all have quite a few questions for me in how we went about this process, and I'm happy to take any questions. We don't have any questions.
Are there any specific difficulties with this map compared to some similar maps you've done?
If you couldn't hear me, we had a question that were there any specific difficulties with this map compared to any previous maps? Each object you work on is going to have its own nuances and particularities, and you'll have to work within those depending on what the materials are as well as how it's used. And those will give different constraints. For this map, the difficulty was really the paper it was printed on. This was an early example of that wood pulp paper, which was newly introduced at that time. So if you think about how brittle newsprint is today, that has had many advances in technology over the time. Well, this was before any of those advances. So that paper was just in really horrible condition and very easy for it to just fall apart. So that was something that made life a lot harder.
How would you advise people at home to look after their maps if they have some really old maps? How to look after them?
The question was, how would I advise anyone to look after their own maps at home? The biggest thing you can do to protect your maps is housing. So you don't want them to get damaged. Prevention is obviously better than trying to fix it later. So you want to make sure that your maps would be stored in appropriate archival housing. This can either be in acid-free buffered folders, or it could be in either polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene plastic sheeting. That would then protect it from the elements as well as allow you to handle it easily without potentially tearing it. You also want to ensure that your maps are not stored in an area that's too hot or too humid. You want to try and ensure that that environment is stable. And finally, you want to make sure that you handle it well. So you always want to handle any objects of any archival or artistic value with clean, dry hands. You don't want to use gloves or anything like that. Just wash your hands, no lotions, no hand sanitizer, and then you can handle it safely and try support it from underneath as much as possible.
We have another question. I have old scrapbooks on black paper. The paper is crumbling. Do you have any suggestions for home preservation?
Scrapbooks are especially difficult to deal with because of the mixed media that they have. So you'll have the paper of the scrapbook, and then you'll have the objects on the scrapbook, and then you'll have some variety of adhesives and tapes that are used to attach them all together. Again, good storage and good environment is the first step that you can take to ensure that it's not going to get worse in terms of your current environment and what you're dealing with. If there are pieces falling off or anything like that, you can try reattach them with a conservation grade adhesive. An adhesive that you can get at home would be called methyl cellulose, and you can find that on various conservation websites, and that is fairly easy to use. And that is a stable adhesive as well as it doesn't age, so you can use that. Another good piece of advice is to try digitize those scrapbook pages. And you can do that with a simple home camera or even cell phone. This means that you're no longer handling the original that much and then risking tearing it. Every time you handle an object, you're putting at risk of either tearing it, dropping it, spilling something on it. So rather have people use a digital copy than the original and keep the original in a good environment.
We have a few more questions. How do you recommend preserving the binding of old books, diaries, or bound scrapbooks?
That can be very difficult to answer because there are a whole range of bindings. So some things may be sewn, some things may be glue bound, there may be hardcover, soft cover, and those can then affect how the treatment will go. If you have something that is very precious to you, I would recommend that you talk to a professional conservator and see what they have to say. They can then give you good advice on what you can possibly do or not do. If you have something that is precious and you simply can't get to a conservator, I would recommend maybe putting it in an archival box or folder so it's not going to get more damaged. One of the biggest problems which I see with books is when people take it off the shelf, they'll kind of use that little head cap area of the top of the book to try pull it forward off the shelf, and over time that just tears. So to try avoid that damage, what you really want to do is either grip by the full spine or reach behind the book and press from the other side to push it out, so you're not pulling on the top and then causing damage. One thing that I would recommend everyone not do is please don't use any tape, nothing that sticks by itself. That is just a nightmare to deal with later, and you're actually going to cause more damage. So if you don't feel comfortable trying to fix something yourself, talk to a professional and they can give you some advice.
We have a question over here.
Which of the techniques that you utilize is most novice friendly and home friendly?
So the question was, which of the techniques that I utilized was most novice and home friendly? I would say the surface cleaning. Like if something's dirty or dusty, you can, to a relative degree, remove some of that surface dirt. There are a couple of different techniques you can use to do that. Again, those polyurethane makeup sponges, which you can buy from CVS or any of those other pharmacies, you can use to gently remove any dust or dirt. You don't want to press too hard, and you want to always move from the inside of the paper to the edge, not from the edge in, because you may then cause tears and creases. So that's something that you can do. If you're interested in conservation and learning more about conservation, there are a number of different workshops that you can take, which can then teach hands-on training of various techniques, including tear repairs and creating adhesives. We do have our own conservation workshop program, so you can keep an eye out for that for next year. And there will be some that cover paper conservation.
We have a comment and a question. Comment is, great presentation, Sigourney.
Thank you very much.
And has this process been used on other maps?
Yes, this process has been used on other maps. It is a weird thing of paper conservation that in many ways the techniques and methods we use are relatively easy. I could teach someone to wash paper fairly quickly. The difficulty comes in when to apply it and to what extent. So as I spoke of in the presentation, there are a variety of washing methods. So you can wash something, either the blotter washing one, which I did in this case. You could do immersion washing, float washing, slant washing. You can do suction table washing. You can wash with gel and gum. So there's a variety of techniques. The difficulty is how to apply them and to what object. So you have to then, that's that whole assessment process of going, what is this object and what's its materiality and the damage? And what would be the one that's going to give the best result with the least potential damage? You're always weighing the pros and cons of what could go right and what could go wrong and the result that you want to achieve. So I have washed many maps. I've surface cleaned many maps, I've lined many maps, objects and other things. It's just there are various techniques on how you'll do them and with what materials. So even something as simple as deciding what type of Japanese paper needs to be taken into account. There's not just one. There's a variety of weights and types and thicknesses, and you need to choose the one that best fits the object you're working on, so it will have the best long-term outcome.
We have another comment. We enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you again.
I don't see any other questions.
I think we have another question from the floor.
Sigourney, have you chosen the next large project?
Have I chosen the next large project? I don't know. I'll have to talk to the collections manager. Currently, because of COVID-19 and lockdown, the conservation department has had to put a lot of the actual treatment projects on hold because we weren't able to work on them because we were at home. So what we've been doing a lot of is clearing the backlog of work that we had. So there's a lot of book repair that we've been doing, a lot of creating custom enclosures for objects. So we haven't had any new big projects. We do other work here at the archives in the preservation side. So that is looking at the environment around an object to stop it being damaged. So we're doing a microfilm survey to ensure that those will be stored correctly. We're also writing policy and procedures and developing best protocols for treatment and how we want to preserve the archives collection.
If somebody wanted to purchase conservation materials for the documents they have at home, where do you suggest they look?
We do have on the Georgia Archives website, there is, I can't remember exactly offhand under what tab, but there is a help area in the website, and that has some preservation guides, and there is a list on one of those preservation guides of where you can buy materials.
Any other questions?
You mentioned workshops here. Would you maybe talk about an upcoming one?
I was asked to talk about upcoming workshops here at the Georgia Archives. We are currently in the planning process for next year's workshops, and we had a very successful run of workshops this past year, even despite COVID, which made us very happy. We will be doing 4 workshops next year. They will be done quarterly, and the first one will be done on preventative conservation. So that will be how to look after the environment, storage, handling, and the various degradation factors that may affect collection materials or even your at-home collection. So I would advise everyone keep an eye out for that. And then we'll be having some later on, and we are also currently in the talks with a non-book and paper conservator to do one on a field that's a little outside of our usual arenas. So if you're interested in branching out and learning more about other aspects of conservation, you should also keep an eye on that.
And they can go on our website to find out that information.
Yes, it will be up on the website and advertised in every place we can think to advertise it, as well as Facebook. So please keep an eye out for that if that's something you're interested in. And it's not limited to conservation professionals. Anyone is welcome to come join our workshops, even if you are just somebody who wants to better look after their own family collection and materials.
I think that's it, unless we have any other questions. Thank you to Sigourney. She did an absolutely wonderful job. Thank you for this interesting and informative presentation. Please join us on December the 11th for another wonderful program, a brief history of the Atlanta Fire Department by a 5th generation Atlanta firefighter, former Atlanta Fire Chief Joe Talbot. Have a happy Thanksgiving.